Overcoming sexual temptation. To avoid the trap of immorality, we must flee from anything that might cause us to yield to sexual temptation. Here now is Gene Getz.
Of all the men in the Old Testament story, Solomon failed to practice what he preached. And we certainly see that in his life. But what he spoke was the truth. In spite of his failures, God used him to speak the truth. And notice in Proverbs 5, verses 1 and 2, my son, again addressing Rehoboam, my son, pay attention to my wisdom. And Solomon had wisdom. In fact, God said he was one of the wisest men in the world. At this moment, he had wisdom. Listen closely to my understanding so that you may maintain discretion and your lips safeguard knowledge. What a powerful statement. Listen carefully, he said. But he also went on to say, avoid deception. Avoid deception. We see this in verses 3 and 4. Though the lips of the forbidden woman drip honey and her words are smoother than oil, in the end she's as bitter as wormwood and as sharp as a double-edged sword. Now again, remember that Solomon used the godly woman to represent wisdom. He used the immoral woman to represent worldly wisdom. So in essence, there's two meanings here, I believe. One is this worldly woman, this ungodly woman, this immoral woman, represents the wisdom of this world, which has many aspects to it, not just sexual immorality. But I think it also has a literal meaning in this particular text, because he goes on to say, avoid seduction. So now, my sons, he's broadening this, listen to me and don't turn away from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her. Don't go near the door of her house. Now that can both be symbolic, metaphorical, but it also can be very literal, because sexual immorality oftentimes is the essence of worldly wisdom, which leads to all other aspects of failure in our lives. So it's an interesting metaphor, and also an interesting literal statement. Now, the next point I call Solomon's prophetic failure. I could actually call this his pathetic failure. But notice what we read in Proverbs 5:13-14. I didn't obey my teachers or listen closely to my mentors. Who was his greatest mentor? David. Unfortunately, David violated his own teaching. I didn't obey my teachers or listen closely to my mentors. He knew the truth, but he said, I am on the verge of complete ruin before the entire community. What a sad statement from the lips of Solomon. It's a prophetic statement of what's going to happen to him. You know, when you look at the Old Testament, in spite of all this paganism, you have some incredible illustrations of godliness and integrity. And if I threw out a question and you answered, who is one of the young men in the Bible that stands out, you'd say Joseph. Here he was, sold into Egypt. He became a slave to Potiphar. And Potiphar was right next to the Pharaoh. In fact, he was probably his bodyguard. And you know the story. Potiphar's wife, don't know whether he had one wife or more than one wife. He certainly had concubines, we can assume, servant girls, but his wife, maybe his primary wife, took an interest in this young man. And she tried to seduce him. She tried to get him to commit to her in an immoral situation. And when I think about that, here's a young guy, he's probably about 18. This was before even the law was given at Mount Sinai. And in spite of the fact that he had 11 brothers that were bad examples, particularly 10 brothers, Benjamin was his younger brother, but his older brothers who had sold him into Egypt were very bad examples. He had a father, Jacob, who certainly wasn't a great example. That's why Jacob was called a deceiver. That's what the word Jacob means. In spite of all of this, he maintained his human integrity. Notice what he said to her. But he refused. Look, he said to his master's wife, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority. He has given me authority over everything. He trusts me. How can I violate that trust? Now that's human integrity from a young 18-year-old guy that was being seduced day after day after day. But he said something else that I call divine integrity. No one in this house, he said to this woman, the wife of Potiphar, no one in this house is greater than I am. I'm over this whole household. I'm over all of the servants as well, which is somewhat ironic because in some respects he was also responsible to her as the wife. So it worked both ways. But he said, I have power. Potiphar's given me this. And then he goes on to say, he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do such a great evil and sin against God? Isn't it interesting, before God ever said from Mount Sinai, thou shalt not commit adultery, Joseph is practicing it from the law that was written in his heart relative to moral purity. What an incredible example of a man that, a young man, that demonstrated this human and this moral and divine integrity. In the New Testament, Paul shared the same principle with young Timothy. He said this to Timothy, flee from youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. And that's a fascinating statement because Timothy grew up in Lystra, and it was a pagan city. They worshiped the gods of the Romans. Zeus, for example, the temple of Zeus existed there. And I have no doubts, since his father was a pagan, and we read about that in Acts chapter 16, his father was an unbeliever. No doubt his father went down to the pagan temple. No doubt he was engaged in immorality. No doubt he was a part of the religious worship. Prostitution and temple prostitution was a part of his lifestyle. And in spite of all of that, young Timothy, because of the influence of his grandmother and his mother, who were godly Jewish women, he maintained his moral balance and became a great disciple of Paul and missionary to serve God in the way he served him. But he faced temptation. Can you imagine? A young single guy. And that's why Paul encouraged him, flee from those youthful passions. Here's a question to think about, a practical question. Why is it so important that we model with our lives what we say with our mouths? Wow. That is practical, isn't it? It's interesting that Solomon violated that principle. Even David violated it. But it leads to disillusionment. It really leads to disillusionment. Yes, God does marvelous things in people's lives, but the fact is that disillusionment can destroy people. It can lead people astray. It can destroy faith. It can eliminate the influence of any teaching that is positive. Disillusionment is a powerful motivator in walking away from God. And so, disillusionment, it leads to often disaster. And it doesn't have to be moral inconsistency. I remember in my own life as a young Christian, really trying to find myself. Even after I graduated from Moody Bible Institute, there were 3 Christian leaders. I trusted all 3 of them, but I saw in their life there were issues in terms of unity that really disillusioned me. I know they all 3 trusted me because they all 3 came to me privately and were sharing things with me about the others. And can you imagine what that did with a young man at that particular time, just a young man in the early 20s, still trying to find out who I was and get established theologically? It was almost my undoing. Literally, it was almost my undoing. I was so disillusioned, I didn't want to continue with my life. But God redeemed me in that situation in some marvelous ways. And I learned a lot from that process. And one of the things I learned from that process is I said to myself, with God's help, Gene, don't ever allow yourself to disillusion other people because you preach one thing and you live something else. Don't do that. And that's been my prayer all my life. I've failed. I've made mistakes. But one of the things I pray for, Lord, help me to practice what I preach.